Hi there, how are you doing? Hope you are staying safe and well. The world seems to be getting, well, it's not getting a better place, I'll put it that way. There's lots of horrible things going on, but it feels like in terms of emerging out of lockdown, that is starting to happen in some places, in some jurisdictions. So maybe at some point, if you're still stuck in your house, you will get out of your house. Who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. I'm talking about something today that a few people thought was the cause of the whole COVID-19 crisis, which is crazy. And I'm doing this as part of a request. Now, if you were watching, last week I didn't do a video, I was doing something with Current Consulting, which you can watch. I put it up on my LinkedIn page, you can look at it there. But I asked about a week ago, if there are any topics that people would like me to cover, and I had some responses on my LinkedIn account. So I had somebody ask me if I could cover data and market dominance, which I will. I'll probably do that next week. A few people said I should go through Black Mirror episodes and choose my favorites, which I am very tempted to do, and how so many of them do impact on technology and issues in terms of both legal issues and morality issues around technology. Incidentally, if you're interested, about a year ago, I appeared on the Jim Jefferies show talking about facial recognition and social credit systems. You can probably find that on YouTube. If you just Google Jim Jefferies facial recognition, it will come up. I'm there briefly in the harbour talking about some of the challenges and issues that you might face. And it's big news. Again, facial recognition is becoming one of those things where, wow, the technology is so cool, but is it something that's going to go horribly, horribly wrong for us? But this week, I'm going to talk about 5G. It was one of the requests. Now, I've talked about 5G before and its impact on things like the Internet of Things and infratech. There'll be a bit of an overlap today, certainly in terms of the Internet of Things, but I wanted to do a bit of an explainer. Everyone talks about 5G, and nobody seems to really talk about what it is and how it works and how important it is. I'm going to try and do this in the most basic terms possible. I will try. Some of the technology is a bit complicated, some of it inevitably will be too complicated and I will get it wrong, but I'll try and make it so that everybody can understand. First things first, all those fears, I've talked about this before, I still think it's crazy, but people are still peddling the same nonsense that 5G is going to kill everybody in the world, be it through creating a virus, which is nonsense, or that the radio waves, the frequency levels of 5G will be so high that everyone's brains will be fried. I also saw one recently said that it's enabling people to be controlled. I wouldn't say that's 5G technology itself. Maybe perhaps in some of the ways it could be used, you could see how that may be the case. But that is way outside the scope of what I'm going to be talking about today. So 5G. You must know about it. It is a buzzword everywhere. People talk about their 5G phones, which often have absolutely nothing to do with 5G. It's become a marketing buzzword. But what it actually is the next standard in terms of cellular communication. So 5G, why is it better? Well, obviously it's got more Gs. No, that's not why. But if you don't know what people talk about mobile phones and cell phones, cellular phones. I always found cellular phones was a better way to describe how they work. In that they work, you take your phone, I just had it in my hand, and as you walk around, your phone will connect to a signal, to essentially a radio signal where data and communications are passing through it from various cells, various base stations, various towers, all around where you are, that essentially that signal is handed off between place and place. You may find if you drive somewhere, if you go very quickly, or some places if you go on a train, it's really frustrating when I used to get the train in the UK, that as you were going too fast or you were going between areas where there's good coverage and bad coverage, your signal will rise and fall very quickly. That's because your signal is being handed over from tower to tower to tower. It can if you ever want to test this, if you're traveling between two different countries with two different essentially phone networks, you can see it when you suddenly get your roaming notice that you are now passed into a new area. Here in Hong Kong, it's very easy. If you get the ferry to Macau, you will have it happen while you're on the ferry. So you go, oh, there's just been a handover between, maybe I'm the only person nerdy enough to think this, there's just been a handover between two towers. Now, all mobile phone cellular technology all runs on this concept of having lots of different base stations, lots of towers, all with the communication taking place between each. And they all rely on basically radio waves that then will transmit data to whatever device you happen to be using. Now, the different evolutions of technology have had different advantages and disadvantages. The advantages have always stacked, so you always carry through what you've had in the previous generation. We try and diminish the disadvantages as we go. So if you think about 1G, and remember their 1G phone, Probably not very many people remember their 1G phone. They were massive things. If you were a yuppie in the 80s, I obviously was not a yuppie in the 80s. I don't think anyone now would confess to being a yuppie in the 80s. You might have had a giant phone that was only really any good for voice, probably running, if it was decent enough, but not necessarily, off 1G cellular technology. But the big explosion, the area where everyone really got into mobile phones and everyone was obsessed with them, was 2G, which the biggest advance there was easy, quick communication, and certainly data with text messages. So this was data being transmitted through the cellular network, but only in tiny, tiny packets. It wasn't very efficient. You did have attempts at 2G internet, which were okay. I remember trying to download something on a 2G phone. I think it was just a ringtone, and it took ages and ages and ages, and then I got my bill, and I thought, oh my God, what a complete fool I was. Particularly because it was a Nokia phone, so it was a rendition of a popular music tune just going beep, 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 so you could have been absolutely anything. But there we go. Then we got 3G. 3G was where the internet started to hit phones properly. You will remember, if you were of a certain age, the 2G iPhone, which wasn't really that great and certainly wasn't like the iPhones you would see today. At the time, though, it was a revolution. And then the 3G iPhones, where this was the point where you could use things like Google Maps, essentially use it as a sat-nav device, where you could download with reasonable speed internet pages and browse, and it would work. Then we have 4G, which is what most people are on now, which has itself evolved as time has gone on. 4G was where we really had the internet on our phones. We could stream videos, we can stream music. Suddenly it's as if you're connected all of the time. Now it's not as fast, generally, unless you live in the absolute middle of nowhere and your internet connection is terrible. It's nowhere near as fast as what you would get at home from a proper dedicated wired network, but it does its job. Here in Hong Kong, most people walk around face glued to their phone. Watching whatever it is they're watching, often videos. I often wonder how they don't bump into people, then they bump into me and I realise that they don't care. 4G's been through various evolutions. In fact, all of the Gs have evolved as time's gone on before the next sort of big development has come on. So 4G LTE is what we're now using, and which is very, very fast indeed. Now they're all using, remember I said they're all using cellular towers, they're all using bits of radio spectrum. I'll talk about that in more detail. So 5G, what is 5G? 5G is the evolution. This is where you essentially, for many users, it will just seem like a very fast version of what they already have. So we have greater internet speeds, up to 100 gigabit speeds in theory now, it could potentially increase, on your phone, which will be faster than many people's internet in their houses. You also have very low latency. Latency, if you don't know what that means, it's how long it takes for you to make a request for some data and the data to come back. So that will essentially detect, if you, a good example, search for a website, if you've got a latency problem, you type into Google and you wait and you wait and you wait and eventually you get some sort of result. Well, latency with 5G, very, very quick indeed, so it can make almost instantaneous communications. This makes it great, not necessarily for watching things on your mobile phone, but great for Internet of Things devices that need quick communication and don't necessarily always then need to be connected to a router to the internet. So that's kind of exciting too. It also promises essentially more connections and more stability on connections in the fact that as you walk around, you won't necessarily drop your connection. Now, I've got notes for this one. How exciting is this? Now, obviously it's an evolution. 5G uses essentially the same technology as 4G, just upgraded and essentially used in a manner that can essentially take more advantage of the efficiencies within that system. So it's still using, get me with this, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, but it can use a greater amount of radio spectrum. So I said I'd explain radio spectrum. Did you ever have an old radio with a dial and a frequency band? And if you wanted to listen to a particular station, you would scroll through. In fact, old TVs used to be much the same. If you had an RF signal, you'd go through and you'd have to find whichever section it was that had the communication bit you want. And you would have hopefully your favorite radio station would have sufficient power coming from its radio transmitter that you'd be able to pick it up, but you'd have to get it in a very specific bit of the band. Now, radio spectrum for communications and mobile communications in particular, where it's being hit the most in terms of we've got a limited amount, is limited. You have a band, you have your dial on the radio, and there are only so many frequencies available. And a lot of those frequencies have been carved out. The digital television signals will be using some of the frequencies. Existing phone systems, you may find that they're being used for military use, so bits have been cut out there. So you have this sort of battle of who is allowed to use certain frequencies. And now, one of the most interesting things we're seeing with the rollout of 5G is that all over the world, there are essentially auctions taking place where people bid for what element of the spectrum they want for their 5G communications. Now, the GSMA, who are basically, think of them as telecommunications gurus. They're great. They do a lot of white papers. Have a look at their website. Sometimes it's very difficult to understand. It goes straight over your head, but often it will give you lots of tips. And I've used a lot of their information putting together this talk, which is very helpful indeed. But they are like saying we should be prioritizing more than anything mobile communications, not necessarily just phones, in terms of the radio spectrum available. Obviously, you've got lots of people who may argue with that, but it's needed for 5G to work. Now, there are essentially, when you're allocating your spectrum, you have various bands within that spectrum which 5G can use. So you've got low band 5G, mid band 5G, bear with me with this, and high band 5G, okay? Now, go back to when I was talking about cellular transmitters. All around Hong Kong, in this building here where I am now, and I'll use Hong Kong as an example, there are cellular transmitters stored in buildings, potentially at the top of some of the hills, and they've all got base stations in, all basically being used by different mobile operators, communications operators, and they're all outputting essentially their radio signal. They're all being used to connect your mobile phone to. Now, there's an issue there in that you only have so much space in various areas for these communications, let's call them towers, even though they're often in buildings here. You only have so much space for base stations, and you've competing demands for signal. Now, certainly when we had 2G and with 3G, these base stations could be very far apart. They would hand over as you go between towers. But as the requirements for more communication and faster communication have changed, they've needed to be close together. So it's not uncommon to have multiple base stations, lots of base stations in one small place. You could walk through, for example, in Hong Kong, a subway, and you'll find lots and lots of different handover points because there's different base stations all providing communication. Remember, the bigger demand, the more connections you need, the more base stations you need. Now, 4G was kind of a bit of a sweet spot. It was one of those things where, certainly if you're in an urban area where they were built up the infrastructure, you could generally get a 4G signal pretty much anywhere. Certainly I've been around London, it can be a bit of a challenge, but you can get it. It might not be as fast as you want. When you go out into the rural areas, you'll probably drop down to 3G. If you go and visit where my parents live, you will inevitably go down to 2G or find you've got no signal whatsoever. So there's an issue in providing the correct coverage. Now, the problem with 5G is it's not always going to be the same level of service. 5G needs more transmitters, essentially more cells, I suppose I could call it that are outputting the signal to work efficiently. So for low band 5G, you have a greater distance between your transmitters, between essentially the cells making up the network, but the speed's not going to be great. It's essentially going to be no better than 4G. It could even in some cases be worse. And this isn't really what's being marketed as 5G for everybody. The next issue is the next step up rather, is mid-band 5G. Transmitters are close together. That means the signal is slightly faster. This is really, I think, what people are seeing as the future of mobile telecommunications. And this is where you've got people arguing as to where they can put their base stations, people asking for building permits, people trying to basically essentially put more transmitters into the world around you. This is probably also the thing that's made the conspiracy theorists think, oh no, we're all going to die because of this crazy stuff that you're building, even though none of us died from the previous crazy stuff that you were allegedly building at the time. But there we go. But that's what you're going to see. I think that is what you're going to see mostly as how 5G will work. But there is high band 5G, which previously has been considered only really usable for military and maybe even emergency use. Emergency transmissions would be very good. This is where the latency is very, very quick. It's very quick communications. It's very high levels of data can be transmitted. So you're at the top of the amount of bandwidth that you get, but the transmitters have to be very close together. Sometimes so close that if you had a building, I was walking, say, for example, through this office, I would be handing over to different transmitters as I'm walking along to keep that signal accurate. Think of it, if you will, if you ever have a Wi-Fi system in your house, the further away you get from your router, your wireless router, you find the signal drops, okay? So for essentially to have the equivalent of high band 5G with a Wi-Fi signal, even though it's non-equivalent, I'm just using this to try and make it more simple, you end up putting additional base stations, additional Wi-Fi transmitters or bridges, or if you're using a mesh network, of additional mesh points throughout your house to hand over your signal between your device. Those are the differences. Most people, certainly at the consumer level, don't get told any of this, so you may find that you get sold a 5G mobile phone service, you live in the middle of nowhere, and you go, what is the difference? Why is it any better? It's not going to be any better simply because the transmitters aren't there. Now, what are the advantages of 5G? I've talked about the lower latency. I don't think there's much to be gained in terms, at the moment, in terms of your mobile phone. I mean, maybe I'm privileged living in Hong Kong, where we do have a pretty impressive, a fantastic, I would say, mobile phone networks, where it's very fast and there's hardly ever any downtime. Latency is fine. So you're not really gaining much, I think. The big gain in 5G is the fact that it can transmit data very quickly, lots of data, and it's a revolution for Internet of Things. Now, I've talked about Internet of Things before, but imagine if everything is 5G enabled, every device can speak at all times, and I'm not going to repeat what I've said in previous videos, but essentially it makes the internet everywhere and very fast. And that's why it's cool. Autonomous vehicles really need 5G internet to work effectively. They probably need mid-band or high-band 5G to be effective as well. So that's one of those things. But that in a nutshell is what 5G is. Now, there are issues, not necessarily with the technology, which I think is pretty exciting, though it's still being developed. There will be, as there has been with 4G, as there has been with all the other Gs, there will be an evolution of the technology as time goes on. You can only get 5G technology really in certain cities around the world. There's a good list you can find online. You'll find that's because they need the transmitters in place for it to work. Should you go and buy a 5G phone? Up to you. There aren't that many available, but I kind of want to get one, but of course I'm in the Apple ecosystem, so I'm probably going to have to wait for the iPhone 12. The iPhone 11 is going to help me with that. It would be good to see, but I don't think it's going to be this massive revolution that you're going to expect. You're also not, there's been lots of talk about essentially 5G, meaning you will no longer need wired internet. You'll no longer need the internet coming into your house via fiber or copper or however you happen to be getting it. There is a market for essentially SIM card enabled 5G routers, as there is one for 4G routers in specific use cases, but I don't think it's going to replace your home internet. Remember, you're going to have to live pretty close to transmitters for it to work. And if you think about it, the transmitters themselves, well, we'll talk about them in a minute, they are essentially working off a wired network underneath in most cases. They're not always just handing it straight over from one to the other. Now, issues in terms of not the consumer level, but at the issue for those who are actually providing the service, manyfold. The biggest one really is spectrum. So people are arguing as to what radio spectrum they have, and then there can only be certain numbers of 5G providers. The second one is in terms of the need for more base stations, you've got to build them. So one of the reasons all these things are taking so long to roll out, we just haven't gone switched on, there's your 4G gone, here's your 5G, you've got to build the infrastructure. It's quite a construction job. Not only you've got to get the building permits for where you're going to put the base stations, you've got to make sure they're in places that are safe, the places where they're going to be protected, you've got to get permission of the building owners. It can be an uphill struggle. It's not something that telecoms providers aren't used to. I'll be honest with you, when I did a lot of work with a particular telecoms provider, we spent most of our time arguing over base stations, who had access, who could be put where the transmitters could be, because they're often shared. Base stations will share different companies, essentially telecommunications equipment in one place, but that is an issue. The next issue, of course, is one of security. I'm not going to go into detail, but you will be aware that there's lots of fears that if people, because 5G could be so wide-ranging and used for Internet of Things, that if the wrong company is involved and they decide to want to do something malicious, either because they're state-sponsored or they're just not very nice people, it could be an issue. My response to that is evidence or no evidence. If you don't trust someone, for whatever reason, don't get them involved in your communications network. Simple as that. And political allegiances aside, I think that's pretty much obvious things. You wouldn't get, for example, someone you don't trust to come into your house and basically do the plumbing, put it that way. The other legal issue, of course, is all of the fears that people think they'll be guaranteed particular kinds of service and they may not come through. And security issues, because if things are low latency, if things are connected to the internet, if things are operating on Internet of Things infrastructure and they're not being updated and protected against potential hacks, then it is very, very easy to be hacked. And then you may find we get an increase in cyber attacks. But again, I've covered that in other videos. Now, I hope I've made 5G, the technical aspect of what it is and how it works, very, very clear. In terms of when it's going to really take over the world, I still think we're looking at 2021, subject to things being delayed with COVID. I think those who are now rushing out to buy 5G phones, they may think they're at the forefront of technology, but it's a bit like buying a games console on day one when only 3 games have come out. It's fun for a while, but then you run out of things to do. It won't really take effect until we've got more infrastructure in place. But there we go. If you have any questions or you want me to go into more detail on any topic, I've tried to rush through and I've tried to keep it relatively short because it was certainly more technical than most of the things that I do. By all means, please do let me know. I will be back next week where I've agreed to talk about data and market dominance, which will probably be me talking a lot about Facebook, Twitter, Google, and he who controls the data controls the world. Or is it one ring to rule them all? One data center? I don't know. I'll try and think of better film-related references to want to have. In the meantime, I've been Paul Haswell. Have a great rest of the week. By all means, please do subscribe, and I'll link to the other videos that are relevant to this one that give more detail about how 5G can be used and misused. And yeah, have a good one. I'll see you very soon.